Let me welcome you to our first session of our series of dynamic conversations that Julie and I will be hosting on a monthly basis on the topic of organizational change and people's well-being. So we're going to look at the interplay between these two. You notice that Julie is not around, so she had to pull out of this session very last minute to deal with a family emergency. So what was meant to be mostly a conversation between the two of us, including you in it, it's going to be starting with just me today. So I hope you'll all participate to contribute to the conversation. Otherwise, that will be an awkward conversation with myself. So as I said, this is the first of the series. So we're launching it today, and we hope to have it on a monthly basis. Today is more an introduction to the general topic, why we're doing the series, what brought us to wanting to share that space or create that space for all of you to contribute. And in the following sessions, we'll dive into more specific topics, right, related to change and well-being. So, for example, we'll have like stakeholder engagement, change resistance, readiness, adaptability, change leadership. And in each of those sessions, what we'll do is Julie and I will start by sharing our observations, our thoughts, some food for thoughts, I guess, to generate or trigger the conversation. Then we'll invite you to contribute to the conversations, because it's meant to be not just us sharing what we see, but it's meant to be a space where we co-sense what's going on in the area of change as it interacts with well-being, get a sense of the systemic challenges we all face as we're trying to deliver change in organizations. But it's also, as we contribute all to the discussions, not only we'll gain a better understanding of what we're dealing with, but hopefully we'll generate insights, new ideas to help us navigate that new landscapes. And also, obviously, because Julie and I value your time, we'll make sure that we offer you some practical tips at the end, some suggestions of how to integrate organizational change and well-being, or how to support, people's well-being as you deliver change, if you want. So I'm going to introduce myself and Julie, who's not here. So for those who don't know me, so my name is Chantal Audet, as you can see there. I'm the founder of Alive Aware Daring, so providing services, consulting, coaching, facilitation, and training services in organizational change and well-being. And Julie Hodges, who is not here, unfortunately, today, she's a professor at the Durham University Business School, a leading expert in organizational change and author of several books on leading and managing change, particularly people-centric change. So as I said, I'm dealing with both personally in my business with org change and wellness and well-being. And this is the reason I'm now doing both, is because of my experience in organizational change. So throughout my practice over the years, I've noticed that what make or break a change, but not make or break a change, what makes a change initiative a success is usually how we take care of people as we go along. And I think my experience is, although we have all the frameworks and the tools and the processes to support people through change, in the current environment we're in today, they are limited in the sense that we're dealing with a level of complexity and challenges that are basically, that limits us, basically. The tools are good for like very controlled, very linear changes, but with an environment where people are already tired, we're dealing with a lot of changes at the same time, with the context we're in, where people are facing a lot of uncertainty. There's no way around then to also look into or care for how people feel as they engage with the change we're leading. So that's what brought us to try to consider how can we rethink the way we manage change to really consider the well-being of people, because it's been proven so far that the way change is managed will impact people's well-being. So there are statistics, I think one from Australia shows that's one of the top leading factor for mental illness in the workplace is poor change management. So we know if we don't do a good job, it will impact people. But what I've noticed too is if people are already stressed out, fatigued, if they're not in a good place, they have a harder time engaging in the change as well and making it a success. So we'll look at those two and how they interface. And I'm sure that if you're here, it's because that combining those two topics together resonated with you. So I'm looking forward to hear from you and how what you think about this topic. The other thing as well I would like to say as an introduction to this overall topic is when you look at what organizations are facing today, personally, I would say I see two almost like competing priorities. Organizations need to change, transform, and move forward with the change agenda. There's lots going on, whether it's hybrid workplace or transforming practices, make sure that we can adapt to the environment and face climate change, for example, challenges, etc. So we have like a big change agenda in most organizations, if not many changes happening at the same time. But the other priority is people's well-being. The rate of burnouts, is increasing. People are, having all sorts of health issues, and they struggle with just being their best at work. So organizations have been investing and continue to invest in well-being. But what I see is it's almost like it's either or, right? So we say, yeah, we care about well-being and people, but we're so eager to push the change forward that we drop well-being on the side sometimes, right? It's seen as we either invest in one or the other. What I would like to challenge you today, and I think if you're here, you probably are in the same line of thought to some extent, is why can't we consider both as being supporting of one another? Like the way we manage and lead change, to manage it in a way where we support well-being, but also investing in well-being will also support the change agenda in the transformation. So it's food for thoughts, and this is where we'd like to explore together here, but we want to create a space for all of us to share, right? It's not just for us to give to you, but it's for all of you to learn from one another. Today's session is a bit shorter because it's introduction to the series. Depending on the engagement and interest in having conversations, the next sessions might extend a little bit more. So we have more room for smaller group conversation and bigger group conversations. Sounds good? All right. So I'm going to have a conversation with myself right now, right? To make it awkward. The first thing I'd like to share is I guess it's coming from a personal experience, but also I think it resonates with the people I work with. So all the people I know are working in the area of change, like leading change, managing change, who are interested in looking at the people's side of a project or a change, usually do it because they care about people. We do it because we want people, to participate. We want them to embrace the change, and we want to do it with them, right? And we also, in general, when we make a change, we do it for what reason? We do it to make it better, not only for the organization, but for people, for clients. So behind this, basically, there's a consideration of well-being. But what happens is as we start delivering the change, we put so much pressure on ourselves and on teams and on stakeholders to move forward and and make the change happen, that sometimes along the way, we forget why we're doing this in the first place. So we deliver in a way that we actually put more stress, more pressure, or, we basically make it inefficient sometimes in the way we deliver. And so basically we're negatively impacting people along the way. And I think when we say poor change management is impacting well-being or creating mental ill health to some extent, it may be in some cases because we're not doing enough in change, but sometimes it's maybe because of how we do change management. And this is what I'd like to introduce to you is to really, my initial thoughts on this is to positively influence well-being as we deliver change. We can look at the why we do it and the how we do it. So for example, you're all experts, you all have some knowledge on change, I'm pretty sure. So based on what you shared in the comments, you're all somewhat involved in change management to different degrees. So you probably understand why you do the activities. You understand why you communicate. You communicate to raise awareness, you engage for buy-in, you train people so they have the skills and they can, adopt the change. So this is what I would call the why, small little why of why we do change management. But if you look behind this, there's probably a why. I feel there's a why, like capital Y reason why we do it. It's looking at how it is impacting people. So some people, I don't know if that's your case, but as we look at why are we communicating, why are we engaging, etc., the big why, it's based on understanding how people, how they work, how their brains work, are they actually reacting from an emotional perspective? And so basically the big why is how do we care for their own states, their own well-being behind it. And so if you look at it this way, for example, we don't communicate just to raise awareness. We communicate to raise awareness, yes, but you do it so that people's brain, when they face the change, are not in a reactive mode. They're not in defensive. They don't get caught off guard and suddenly they are in stress mode and they just can't think and adapt. You engage them, yes, for buy-in, but mostly so that they feel like they can open it, they can contribute, they're more open to learning. So if you don't engage them in the right way, then you're going to have them closed. They won't be open to the change and to learning, for example. So just introducing this as if you start thinking of the big why behind the why you do certain things when you manage change, going beyond and understanding how people feel, how they react, how they work from the brain perspective, stress response perspective, how they manage emotions, that can give you another flavor as to how to approach your activities. And that leads me to the how as well. So the how, I think, makes a big difference, especially if you look at the emotional aspects. So when we lead or manage change, we say, well, change is a journey. It's not just from being unaware to aware and ready. It's also an emotional journey. So we understand that, and we, have all sorts of strategies to reduce resistance, to support, people processing all these emotions. But really, what we don't pay attention to is the emotional signal we send when we communicate, when we engage, etc. So if you look at that, the how, for example, if I start communicating, I may be saying the right things. I'm preparing people for, the change coming up, so they're aware. So we reduce a little bit the surprise effect on their brain. But if all my messages are communicated from a place of pressure, like I'm rushed in time, I don't have enough resources, or we have to change otherwise, whatever, like this fear-based messaging, how do you think people will be reacting? So we're sending an emotional energy that's probably not conducive for people to feel confident, to feel calm, optimistic, and willing to engage and collaborate. So we have to think of the how in terms of what energy do we send people. So these are things that I've been playing with in my practice, and that's just the very high level consideration for how I think well-being and change can interplay. And it's just a starting point for a conversation, I guess, with you, with all of you. Unfortunately, you won't have right now another input or perspective from Julie, who's not here to share some initial thoughts on this topic, but at this point, I'd like to turn over to you and hear from you. And I would say, let's start with, just initially, what resonates with you, with what has been shared so far? And, what's your experience with change when you think of change and well-being? Does that make sense to you to consider both of those things together? Anybody wants to jump in?
Hi, Chantal. Just like a quick point, just on the last point you were making there around like some of our communications potentially, driving up fear. I mean, that's, in Kotter sort of talks about you need to have a sense of urgency, burning platform, all of these ways of trying to get people to change by, I think it's a process, I think, which is some people change when they see the light, others when they feel the heat. But if you're, making people feel the heat with your communications, maybe that's targeting people who need that to, and are happy to take that on, but you're also going to be, making a lot of people feel the heat who maybe actually aren't in a good place to be able to take that, as you said. It was just, that sort of resonated as a sort of sometimes we can be causing damage with the communications that we do.
Yeah, that's one of I was thinking about too is we say we have to highlight the pain points and why we need to change. So basically connect to this place where people feel it's not okay, we need to change, right? So we need some of that, I know, for in the messaging, but what I've realized, if it's a good place to start to bring people to pay attention, to raise this initial energy, to get the momentum going, it's not sustainable. So we quickly need to shift to, okay, now that you got it, like for example, climate change is a big one if we're talking about something outside organizations. Okay, I think by now most people are getting the sense it's urgent, it's critical, but we've been hearing this message so often now that it can paralyze us, because now we're in a fear mode, right? We're like, okay, I'm paying attention, stress is high, but now it's so high that I'm paralyzed, I don't know what to do. So we need a shift quickly in our interventions to the sense of possibility, the sense of we can create something, the future, there's another future that's possible, and let's aim for that vision and together, progress and go there.
I think there's a challenge with that, though, because I think the challenge is that organizations are so diverse that somebody's vision is somebody else's nightmare. And also what you've got to think about is that if you're selling a vision of the change, you've got to do so that speaks to the majority of people within your organization. And if your organization is very diverse, there's some people who won't get the message, who won't feel comfortable with that. So you've got to think about your communication and how you're communicating and how you're sending the message out, because organizations are really, really diverse. And what we tend to find is that a lot of leaders and managers are okay with the language of change. They know where they are, they know where they want to be. But people in the organization are thinking, will I have a job next week? What does this mean for my relationships within the workplace? And I just think we've got to think about how we're communicating, what we're communicating, and making sure that that message is delivered in such a way that it speaks to the majority of people in the organization. Because what happens is a lot of messages do not speak to everybody. They speak to a selected few. And those that aren't communicated with, they feel anxious. That has an impact on their well-being. So we've got to think about it in that way as well.
It's a good point, Mark. Yeah. And I guess when we think about communication, maybe I think of it two ways, right? There's the big communications, like the messages coming from the top and across the organization. And then there's, communication that's happening at different levels between people, right? Conversations Absolutely. Like we're having. And this is where I guess it needs to be more nuanced. I'd like to hear your thoughts, but one of the things I've noticed is whatever the message, it really depends on who's actually delivering it and their own energy and presence in the moment. If they're really present, they're calm, and they're in a good place, people will be more reassured, and maybe they'll be able to face their own, I guess, discomfort, their own fears, and feel like they have a space to voice it and process that. Yeah.
Yes, I accept that. But what a lot of organizations do is that they hold the town hall meeting, whether the senior leader is there, they're very calm, they're very eloquent, they talk very openly, and they're talking to a whole range of employees. But people are afraid sometimes to ask that naive question, because they're there with their manager, or they're there with somebody who they think, well, if I ask that question, what are they going to think of me? And when you're in those kind of town hall meetings, it's not what's said in the meeting that's important. It's what people say to each other as they're walking back to their desk or walking back to their car. So you've got to think about how you communicate and give people safe space, where they can communicate in small teams, so that the big communication piece sometimes doesn't work.
Totally agree. Yeah, safe space, you're right, at different levels and smaller groups is Absolutely. The key, right? Yeah. And it's often what's been challenging, I find, is we know, and it's not just for change, right? It's for well-being in general, for fostering belonging and team cohesions. We need space like this where people can come together and have those open conversations and feel heard and feel they can exchange that. But it's so challenging for people to find the time, right? Or value the time. But my experience is when we take the time, people say, oh, I didn't have time to come, but I'm glad I came to have that conversation. I feel so much better. I gain clarity, and whew, right? So it's kind of, how do you, I'm curious to know amongst of all of you, and for you, Mark, maybe, how do you convince, you know, the leaders or managers at different levels that it's worth the time to create that space? Because that's really the key elements, like dialogue, safe space for processing, for making sense of the change, for processing emotions. Just, you know, it's so valuable, and it's an essential component of leading and managing change. But it's the first thing that gets cut, right? As I said, we get so caught up in pushing the change and pushing the agenda and moving forward and making sure that happens, that we skip those steps that are so essential in supporting people.
So Chantal, one of the interesting things that sort of I've grappled with and I'm still parsing is I've worked in organizations that have had very, very sophisticated approaches to marketing to external customers, right? So all the things we're sort of talking about here around segmenting and delivering messages that are really targeted. Yeah, and they've put in a lot of resources into ensuring that they have very sophisticated programs to do that. And then as the follow-up to that, they also have become very good at creating spaces and communities and throwing resources into monitoring and providing support for those communities, and then feeding and having sort of constant feedback loops between that targeting of messaging and delivering messages, and then creating the space to foster the adoption right afterwards, right? But that's all in service generally to acquiring and nurturing sort of their clients. And I've been in a strange situation where I've seen that happening, but then none of that happening to support change internally in their organizations, right? So it comes down to, you know, in some cases, you know, the motivation, right? And maybe the lack of messaging around the benefits internally that could also provide. So I obviously don't have a pat answer or solution to this, but I always find when I encounter this in different organizations that I work in, that it's a strange dichotomy between the two. Just wanted to add that to the discussion.
Yeah, it's a good point, eh? And you know, what comes to mind when you share that is like have all sort of experts dealing with copywriting and storytelling when it comes to marketing and engaging the audience, for example. And there's lots of empathy, trying to understand who we're talking to. So we use their language so they recognize themselves. We also have, you know, from software development, like the user experience, you know, experts, like we do personas and user journeys, and we try to empathize and make sure we understand what they need. This is we're not quite there yet with change management. But although, I mean, for some of you might have seen, I use that as well, is trying to use those approach to empathize with who we're supporting through change. So drafting change journeys to say, okay, what do we want them to experience as they go through the change, get ready for it. And as we empathize with what we want them to experience, then we can design or adapt, you know, the activities and practices for change to make sure we achieve that. And then we speak to their needs and we address the concerns or the questions we can anticipate, for example. That's one way, I think, to really help ourselves to basically taking a step further into, yes, we need to communicate, engage, and train, and etc. But what's the purpose behind it? Like, if we really put ourselves in people's shoes, then we can really open the conversation directly with them, but also just through this imaginary process of a feedback loop where we can say, I can try to imagine how they feel and what they might need. And then as you deliver the messaging, as you try those activities, you just remain open to the feedback and adapt to support them. I don't know if that where I was going with that, but yeah, that's one way. Mm-hmm.
Chantal,
yes.
Just to complement a little bit what was said, I think from Mark's perspective, I like the the communication focused on always that speaks to people about their well-being, and investing into areas that will consider their well-being. And it's very, very important now, because being in the post-pandemic, and I know around the world it may have been a little bit different how it was managed, but in Canada, we're having a difficulty right now to get government employees and back to the office. But things have changed. I think they've discovered in 2.5 years some of the well-being and benefits of working from home, and it's very hard to argue some of those benefits for their well-being. The other thing I think is very important, I think Anna's spoke about it, is the motivation and the benefits that it will have for people. And I think that the way we engage people, I'll talk from a project perspective in large organizations, the way we did it in the past, I had said in the past because everything post-COVID or pre-COVID is in the past now, because the world has changed the way we engage people at work or online. And I think it's there's really a fundamental difference, and I think that has to be kept in mind in organization if they want to do things now in the old ways of pre-pandemic. I think they need to reconsider, because the population or the employees have changed, and the well-being is one of the most important things. And I talk to like our family, our son, he's really interested. He's a manager in the government, and basically he's saying, I want to be able to do things now. I want to be able to do a lot of work, but I want to be able to midday to do other things. And those are some of the things that are challenging for the organizations.
Yeah, the paradigms have changed a little bit. And when you think about it, if you want people to be like, as they participate in change, if you want a change to happen, to be successful, what do you need people to be able to do? Right? So think clearly, you need them to collaborate, to be creative, to be in a position where they can learn and adapt. These are all possible if you're feeling well, if you're not overly stressed, if you have some energy, some capacity, some bandwidth basically to absorb. And that's for people to be able to do that, there are things that we can do. And this is what I'd like to go next, and we'll take another comment, but what can we do as we manage change to ensure that people are in that space, right? Mental, emotional space where they can actually participate and engage. But if, that means as well that we need to allow or consider the impacts of all the other activities. If people have too much on their plates and they don't have time to recharge and do all those things, then they won't be able to participate in the change either. And they want that, right? And what I find very kind of a paradoxical, I guess, if that's the word, sorry, French first language here, is we say as I said, we want to make change happen in organizations to make it better, process more efficient, and improve performance. But as we're delivering change, we're basically sending the opposite signal sometimes. We're putting so much pressure on people, and we all over the place, we don't prioritize, and it's very challenging for people to just survive the change. So we sometimes burn them out before things get better, right, at the other end. So Andrew.
Yeah, well, I think it's good just to maybe offer a different point of view, because in my experience, organizations are very messy, and not everybody does agree with the HR centric view that you've described, for all its merits and everything else. There's, change management's got a long and checkered history, and people see things through different lenses, and organizations see things through different lenses and in different ways. I think part of the finesse of our profession really is to confront these others with the limitations of that thinking paradigm, and actually be able to put forward effective approaches to change management in certain circumstances. And I think what you're doing now is you're raising a very good question about well-being in diverse organizations. To what extent do these traditional change methods, which, let's face it, are used probably 99% of the time, are actually conducive to people's health and well-being? Health and wellness is important, but so often it's all about wealth and hellness rather than health and wellness. Organizations put profits first, and they don't worry. Some of them, what happens to people? They burn them up and they treat people as commodities. That is very much a mindset, a paradigm we have to deal with, right?
Yeah.
I know that's something I recognize, and I just wanted to put that, not because that's necessarily the way things are, but I think it's a different point of view we haven't considered here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Sandra, for your perspective on that. Hushma?
Yeah, I think just hearing everybody's comments and also what you have said, Chantal, what strikes me is are we looking at change from a one-dimensional perspective? People are not one-dimensional. You know, we talk about systemic change and the different lenses, because an individual at work is being required to change, but what else is going on for them in the rest of their life, in their personal life, in their health life, in other areas of work apart from this project? And I think through COVID and just hearing some of the, the other comments, we have seen a change in that. So people are no longer dividing life between work, home, and this way. It is now merging. That system seems to want to interact. I need some time at lunchtime to go for a run, or to pick up my kids, and then I can do a couple of hours later on. That's how I do work and home life, and it gives me the balance. And potentially from a change perspective, are we just thinking about it in that traditional way, as Andrew said, in there around it's one-dimensional, it's about taking people through that change journey. But actually, what's the impact of that change? It's one in a multitude of changes that they may be experiencing. And it's that experience of the multitude of layers that we have on somebody that impacts their well-being. And secondly, I think, the point Anna was making is that, again, that systemic link between what we do for customers and the community that we're working with, and that external focus. But if we don't do self-care internally, that starts to show in that work externally, how we are working with customers, because the organization doesn't stay well. It starts to suffer in that way. And so I'm curious about, what people think, and what are some of the lenses of potentially looking at change, and what's happening for people in that different perspective, rather than just the change that we're managing on a project or on an initiative that we want to see.
Yeah, these are very good reflections. And one thing I've been, this is one of the challenges I think I've been wrestling with is, looking at people's well-being can be a very big scope, right? So one of the questions I have personally is, how much should we take on our shoulders when we lead one initiative, for example, in terms of people's well-being? Because it's a systemic, issue, generally, not only organizationally, but also, in people's life. So individual needs to take the responsibility in how they actually manage their own well-being. The organization has to play its part. Now, I believe that as we lead change, because we're introducing stress, we're introducing additional pressure, additional uncertainty when we are responsible for a change initiative, we might have an opportunity there to influence a little bit positively or reduce the negative impact we have, on people. And now, based on what you just all shared, I'm thinking, is there a way that how we manage and lead change, can we start testing new ways of working and being, right? Where we balance, right, our efforts. So as I said, we're so eager to push the change. We have tight deadlines, but then we forget to take breaks, and the project team gets exhausted, and we get all stressed. And you see, as I say it, I use the same energy. But what if we were to manage the change as within the team in a different pace, taking care of people's well-being within the team, balancing all these things just for the team, then we will send out a different energy to the organization and the people we engage with, right? And we would be more open to consider all these aspects. But it's just a starting point. I'll go with Mark, who has his hand raised.
Okay, let me just sort of say a few words about well-being first. If you're looking at change and transformational change, what lots of organizations do in terms of well-being is that they will run alongside that some kind of employee assistance program. And what they will do, they will signpost people to perhaps external organizations that can support staff who are having challenges with change. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, that's just something that happens. The second approach that a lot of organizations do is they do what I call upstream work, is what can we do within our organization to promote the well-being of our staff? And they will put interventions in place within the organization that tackle that. And again, that's something which happens and does have an effect. There is a third way, though, which I think organizations struggle with, and this is the one that I'd like to advocate, is organizations are having a real systemic view about what is it that we are doing as an organization that impacts upon the well-being of our staff. And what are the systems and processes and practices that we know people are having challenges with? And let's have a deep dive into that. And a lot of organizations find that really difficult to do, but that's the only way really we can start to tackle this kind of challenge that we've got with well-being. I think the other thing as well is, if we are talking about organizations, as we know, are very diverse. We can't look at it through one lens. What is important is that with transformational change is that there are authentic conversations at the outset with a whole range of people in the organization to find out about how it impacts upon them. Because people have got different expectations, different life experiences, different roles, and we don't spend an awful lot of time, or enough time in my view, about having those in-depth conversations before transformational change. And sometimes those conversations are an afterthought rather than something that is planned in right at the beginning. So I think that's really important as well.
These are very, very good points. And I think, Julie, we echo that as well, just like I do, that, authentic conversations, dialogue, like those spaces are like the core, I think, of change. And I would even go further, and I think you would agree, is if we need that initially on the onset to, make sure we understand the different impacts and the different, I guess, perspective across the organization, we need, as well as we start communicating and defining this change, so that people have the space to make sense of it. Because, as we said, we need clear communication. So the way I like to put it is, we need to give people the right pieces of the puzzles, so they have all the same pieces of puzzles, but the way they put this puzzle together in their head really depends on them and their experience and other things happening. So, and the best way to make sure that they have time and they can create or make that sense within their head of the change is through conversations, through diverse perspective, and try to validate what they understand. And over time, we co-create the sense as an organization, and each individual can make sense of it. And as soon as we make sense of it, to some extent for ourselves, this is where the stress level can come down a little bit. We reduce uncertainty, we have a somewhat of a map to navigate, and people are in better position to participate. Virginie.
Oui, merci. Looking at this overall conversation, one of the things that you started with, Chantal, at the very beginning was the notion of what versus how. And this brings me to two concepts I'm trying to convey across the public service of Canada. And it's making a difference between managing change and leading the change. And I often hear people talking about, oh, we need to manage the change. We need change management here. And I'm thinking, no, you need to lead it. A plan is only as good as what's on paper. And if I assume that for most of us here, we've facilitated sessions, we've established a plan, and it's only when we get into the classroom that we know if it works as planned or not, because the people there can just, throw a wrench in our approach, and we have to adapt on the fly. And working with the Department of National Defense, that's what the military was referring to as well. The plan is good until you get boots on the ground, and then you see what emerges. And so that's where the leadership of change kicks in, where you're able, as a solid leader, to work with what's emerging, what's showing up, and responding in the moment with the best possible options available to you at the time. And oftentimes what I see in the public service, I'll speak about the public service because that's where most of my years operating in the world of change have been. People tend to use or take a command and control approach, or what we also call a design and shove type of change. So they'll determine the change in isolation, and they'll really shove it down people's throat and try to get them to buy into the change or get engaged in that change. And to bring this concept back to mental health and wellness, well-being in organizations, when we know that control is highly linked to mental health, just taking a design and shove approach, a command and control approach, deprives people of that bits and pieces of control, or all the control that they could exert as they go through the change. And we often forget about that aspect, which is also often why I find, especially in our culture, very operational, result oriented, I find more difficult to work with leaders in a co-creative, co-development type of approach, where I'd like to bring them to show more empathy, where we try to protect ourselves. I sense that it's a protection attitude. And Chantal, you were talking about how do we show, what is the energy that we share with people? And so having this empathy for others, and taking more of a benevolent leadership approach, and looking at things in perspective, and thinking of unintended consequences of our decisions, taking others into account, really can really make a huge difference in how we lead and get people through the change process and the transitions that come along with it. So again, from a leadership perspective, about the energy that we're sharing with others, what a good self-awareness and self-mastery, that's probably where we can see most of the best senior leaders, change leaders emerge. That's quite a challenge in my work, to find them and support them.
Thanks, Oji. So change leadership is one of the topics we'll explore in the upcoming, conversations that we will be hosting. So we'll dive into this because it's key, I find. I'll take 2 more comments and then we'll slowly move towards the end of the sessions for today. Mark?
Yeah, I was very taken with Tim's statement right at the beginning about people either feeling the heat or seeing the light. And I think, some people do see the light, but maybe see the light in different shades. So we've got to be able to accept that. I also think, leading change, leaders have got to be authentic, and also they've got to show their vulnerabilities as well. And what we've got to remember, I think, is sometimes people will feel the heat, will see the light, will want to embark upon a change journey, but don't know how. And, we're taking them on a path which they've never trodden before. And that path can feel very rocky and unstable. And we've got to help them feel safe on that journey, and help them feel that, their feet are, every step is landing on the ground, which is relatively solid and will carry their weight. So again, we've got to help people understand that as well. And I think, my experience is that, lots of organizations think they are good at change, but they don't necessarily understand the psychological journey people go through in that process. And I think that's where the learning needs to be for leaders is, how do we understand this journey that people need to go through to accept change?
Yeah, this is key. And I think, this is where I find the limits of our change management approach, models and tools. Like, they're all about, just like we did with project management, it's like there are steps and phases and tools and methodologies, and they're not bad, right? To some extent, they are the basics of things that needs to happen, but the core of what it is to lead or manage change or help people through the transition is an internal process that we need to support, right? And I agree with you, Mark, that I see personally my work in supporting change in organization is more about creating the conditions where people can safely navigate this uncertainty and those emotions and come up, on the other side, where we want them to go, but also, that they can stay engaged and sustain the momentum as they go through, because it's an emotional journey first. It's stressful, it's demanding. And I believe it not only starts with the change leaders, but also potentially with the change team and the project team. So we all need to do our own work to manage our own energy and well-being. But what about the project team? I've seen projects successful because the team was able to hold it together and care for one another. And I've seen projects not as demanding and challenging falling apart and not being successful because there was too much tension and frustration and distrust, I guess, in the team that we weren't able to push the agenda forward. Bushra?
I think, Chantal, you hit the point that I was just about to raise, because it is around creating the conditions for change, isn't it? That environment. And it is very much, I think, the area that I'm thinking about is that difference between the change management and the change leadership. It's that change leadership of creating the environment where people feel psychologically safe, they're able to raise the questions, they're able to get the support in order to be able to change. And how do we go about creating that? And I think somebody mentioned, and I would agree, is there's an awful lot of front-loading work that needs to be done. So there's an awful lot of engagement right up front, even before we start and moving into going, this is a project, is understanding what the problem is and helping people to articulate what actually is it that's needing to change. And I think it's an interesting point of what's needed in the environment to create the conditions that enable change in a way that we're not actually stressing people out. We're not impacting their well-being in a negative way, but enhancing it. And how do we co-create that condition for change? And maybe is that a discussion that needs to take place very much up front before we launch into projects or changes that we need to have now? So just more questions rather than answers, I'm afraid.
Wow, there's so much to contribute. This is very interesting, and I think I already can sense that we could, like the upcoming, conversations, we can dive into a little bit deeper on specific aspects of, leading and managing change. And I will often say both, because my perspective is leadership is key, but we also need management, right? Management is kind of taking the chance out of the change, right? We still have proven process that helps get those conversations happening and clarify the destination and make sure we don't forget anybody around the way. So there are, just like project management supports leadership, right? Change management is still supporting change leadership in some ways, depending on how well it's done, obviously. So it's helping leadership, consider all these aspects and creating the conditions for that. So we'll go through some of those things as we go along, because really what I'm interested in creating in this space with Julie and with your participation is getting a little bit clearer on, what are the opportunities, for example, for us in the change management space to positively influence people's well-being? How can we mitigate the additional anxiety and stress we put on people as we introduce change, for example? So many other aspects, I guess. But we'll be tackling these maybe more from a change management perspective. So when the next sessions, we will take it from a perspective of stakeholder and employee engagement. And then we'll look at it from a resistance, readiness, adaptation perspective. And the third one in December will be more change leadership. And really what we would like to see is, getting at not only sensing what's happening and the challenges, but like we were doing today, is just starting to let emerge some of new insights and hopefully different ways of tackling change and leading change, so that we can all walk away with new tools that we can experiment with and learn from one another. I really appreciate your participation. I'm going to share 2 general tips, I guess, that I'd like to offer the community. Again, I'm sure you could all contribute very valuable tips. And Julie, unfortunately, is not here to share her own contribution, but I'm sure she will as a follow-up to the LinkedIn conversation, and we'll come back. She'll be participating. But maybe, Mark, as you mentioned, you co-author some books with her. Maybe you can offer something. So I'll share just two tips, and then maybe I'll let you, if you want, offer something. So two things I wanted to suggest. The first one is related to what I've already kind of introduced, is to pay attention to the quality of the energy you bring in your interventions. For example, what's the emotion that's driving the communications, the engagement? Is it one that's fueled more by joy, enthusiasm, optimism, courage, compassion, empathy? Or are you operating out of pressure, lack of something, distrust, all these emotions that are more draining, but all related to fear. And for example, when the wording you're going to use in your communications, the balancing, as Mark, I think it was Tim mentioned, yes, we need to create draw people's attention by maybe highlighting what's not going well, like the pain points and the urgency, but then how do you make sure that the language is actually fueling enthusiasm and encouraging people to take part of it and sense it's possible. The second tip is, to start by caring for your own well-being, the well-being of your team. I can see, and I've witnessed, if a project team is operating is working well together, and they are balanced, and they are making progress, and they enjoy what they're doing, and they believe in the project and the change, when they engage with stakeholders, it sends such a different energy, and people, just by the interaction, will feel like, yes, I believe in it, I want to participate, I want to contribute. If you come to them and you're like all stressed and you don't have time to listen to anybody, then people will feel it, and without noticing it, what they will do is they will react out of fear. They won't say, I am fearful and I won't listen to you, but suddenly you'll see they'll be defensive, they'll be more critical, they'll have doubts, they'll push back, basically. So this is what we call sometimes resistance. I think it's more a reaction of stress, but if the team is taking care of itself, and if they come with the right energy, then it sends a different signals to the stakeholders, so they can help too. That will be my little 2 tips, generally speaking, how to start caring for well-being as part of leading and managing change. Mark, would you like to contribute something?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, we've mentioned about doing some work up front, and I think that's really important, is having those conversations early on, but also getting the right people around the table as well. Mm-hmm. And, I think as a leader, and you're leading change, you do need to be authentic. You do need to show your vulnerabilities as well. And I think also, understand that the resistance that you get from change is completely natural. It's nothing pathological. It's a completely natural thing, because it's from their perspective. And we've also talked about, putting yourself in other people's shoes. I think you've got to take your own shoes off before you can put your feet in other people's shoes as well. And I think that's an important aspect as well. And also, one thing that I always find is, when you are communicating, is think about the message you want to get across. Think about the avenues of communication you're going to use, and think about making sure that you're speaking to a wider audience as possible. And you may need to, I guess, maybe adapt those methods according to the audience that you want to reach. And what happens in lots of organizations is that they only communicate when they've got something to communicate. But there's sometimes a huge gap between those instances. And in that gap is where the grapevine grows and the rumors grow. So again, make sure the communication is often, make sure that it's purposeful, and sometimes even communicate when you've got nothing to communicate. Mm-hmm. And I just make sure that you have that kind of comms plan set out very, very early on. So it's about doing the homework at the beginning, I think, is really important.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark. These are very valuable. Yeah. And, to touch on the communications often, etc. It's true, right? We tend to want to communicate just when there's something really happening in the project, like we've hit milestones or we're making progress from a deliverable perspective, but there's so many other things we can just share and communicate about, because it's about, you know, people embarking on a journey as well. And just on the last thought, I just remember when we say, like, there's lots for change to happen, like we need all these conversations, and what leaders sometimes forget, and I'm trying to remind them, is when they're ready to communicate the change, they have had already so many conversations between them to figure it out, to make sense of it, etc. And then they suddenly think that one communication will make everybody follow them and understand where they're going. They also need all these conversations, these, you know, they also need the time. So why not, you know, to some extent, engage all these people or the different stakeholders from the get-go, so that you all going through it at the same time, so you don't have to repeat the process with everybody after. Or at least if you don't have the time or you don't want to do this, consider that they also need, right, the time to catch up. All right, so wow, I could just keep going. So by the way, I'm going to close the formal session now, but if anybody wants to just stay, continue the conversation, I'm open to do it. Julie and I, for the next sessions, will plan for 90 minutes so that we have a fulsome dialogue and can really draw some insights from all of you and the conversations. But for now, you know, that's the end of the plan, time to launch the series. So I thank you all for participating. The next one will be on October 27. We'll talk about stakeholder engagement, employee stakeholder engagement. I mean, well-being and change from that perspective. And we'll try to see what can we do in change management or leading change to influence well-being as we engage with people. In November, we'll tackle change resistance, readiness, and adaptation. So how do we include some well-being consideration or practices to support that when we lead change, and then change leadership in December. So this session, or actually a version of that session, will be made available for public, you know, viewing. So it will be put on YouTube, shared on LinkedIn, not the entire session, but a good chunk of it. So you'll be notified through LinkedIn, different messages. If you subscribe to this session through my website, you'll have, you know, the newsletter to get notified when it's published and available to you. Otherwise, just follow Julie or I on LinkedIn, and you'll know when it's ready to be shared and viewed. But stay tuned, right, for the next session. Hopefully you'll join us and invite others to join as well. Julie should be there, hopefully, and hopefully I won't have an emergency and I'll be there as well. Yeah, so that's thank you again for participating, and I'll be staying on now for continuing the conversation if you want to.
Okay, bye everybody.
Bye. Bye.